Hey guys, this is John checking in again from London, England, and this is round 7 of the London Chess Classic FIDE Open. And I was on a good score going into this round, and I faced Grandmaster Benjamin Bok, who had the same score as me, 5 out of 6. So I knew this was going to be a pivotal game, especially in regards to my GM norm chances, because right around here is the point in the tournament you start to think about scoring your Grandmaster norm. My performance up to this point had been pretty strong, and I was just coming off that win against Grandmaster Francesco Grimbaldi, so I was feeling confident. And I had the white pieces as well, which always helps. I prepared pretty thoroughly for this game. Bok is a player who is very theoretically sound and prepared, as are a lot of GMs. He doesn't seem to experiment too much. He kind of sticks to the same main lines. I noticed that he played the Grunfeld, he plays the Nimzo Indian, and he played the opening we had here, which is the so-called triangle variation. So I opened with d4. He played d5. I played c4. He played e6, so Queen's Gambit declined. Knight c3. And now Black's next move initiates the triangle. So he plays c6. And you can tell why it has that name. Black has a triangle of pawns in the middle of the board. Now, this opening could turn into a semi-Slav, perhaps. It could also turn into a Stonewall Dutch in some cases, if Black decides to play for f5. But the critical test of this entire line, Black going e6 and then c6, is for White to take over the center. Because you notice that Black has not developed their knight to f6, as they would traditionally do in a Queen's Gambit declined or a semi-Slav. And my next move is kind of putting the question to Black's setup, and is the real test of whether Black's setup is sound, let's say. So I played e4. There's no knight on f6 to guard that square, so e4 just offers a pawn trade right in the middle. Black took it. I took with the knight. And now Bok played bishop b4 check. So as usual, this is all theory, nothing new so far. Here White has a choice. You can play either knight to c3 or bishop to d2. Bishop to d2 is a gambit because it allows queen takes d4. Black can nab this pawn in the center and attack the knight on e4. There's a whole mess of theory from this position with some really complex resulting lines that honestly I think rival some of the most complex lines in chess, in all of chess theory. This sort of thing isn't really my style, and I wasn't up to the task of trying to beat him in this, trying to beat a very well-prepared grandmaster in a line that he's played before. So I played the more sane move, which is knight to c3. So just retreating and blocking the pin. This line has kind of rose to prominence over the past couple years because, if you recall, Magnus Carlsen used this move to beat Vishy Anand in a key game in their 2013 World Championship match. So White just retreats the attack knight and hopes to use that space advantage that he currently has. Black played c5. So Black just doesn't want to sit back here and allow White to keep these two pawns on c4, d4. That would lead to a White advantage. Say Black just develops kind of lazily something like this. White's going to get a nice position out of this. They're going to go bishop d3 and castle, and probably the bishop will come out to g5 soon if White's able. Black doesn't want to be too slow here. So c5 is trying to destroy that d4 pawn. If I were to take this pawn, I'd be completely ruining my structure. After, say, queen takes d1 check, king takes d1, bishop takes c3, I'd have triple isolated pawns. Temporarily White's up a pawn, but I don't want any part of a position like this. So after c5, I played a3. Now, curiously, after a3, Black usually does not take the knight with check. You might compare this to like a Nimzo Indian and wonder why Black does not take that knight. But most Black players play the more sophisticated move, which is also what Bok did, bishop a5. Because again, Black does not fear the fact that the pawn on c5 is hanging. If White were to take here, then we get that queen trade, and once again, it's like the same line. Just a terrible pawn structure for White. So bishop a5 is kind of sophisticated, maintaining the tension. Now here is where there's a pretty big split. In that game I mentioned between Carlsen and Anand, Magnus played knight f3. There's also bishop to e3 is another move, supporting the pawn on d4. I played knight ge2. I had seen a game at the UT Dallas Fall FIDE Open between Grandmasters Shamanov and Sevian. Sam Sevian was playing black, and Grandmaster Shamanov played this knight ge2 and won kind of a nice positional game against Sevian. So I wanted to give this a try myself, and I was hoping that Bok might not be prepared for this one because there hasn't been as many games with knight ge2 as there has with like knight f3, for instance. So just developing and defending the pawn on d4. Now Bok took on c3. So this appears to be kind of a change of plans, but it makes a lot of sense. I think now that White's knight on e2 is protecting here, I might think about taking this pawn on c5. So he decides that, all right, now I'll take and see which way I recapture. And I took with the knight, even though this leaves the pawn on d4 hanging, which he did indeed take. So c takes d4. I jumped into b5. So now I'm hitting this d4 pawn twice, looking to regain it. Now, let's say black were to play knight c6, simply defending that pawn. Or even e5. You can kind of take your pick. Let's say e5. If e5 is played, how do you think White would want to reply? You can pause your video if you'd like to answer that question. Alright, so White has to be quick because Black is trying to hold on to the pawn. Also, Black's ready to evict that White knight by playing a6 next. So the idea for White is c5, gaining a useful latch on that d6 square. So if allowed, I'll advance this pawn and try to sink that knight into d6 with check on the black king. And White's going to get excellent compensation for a single pawn. So Bok instead played a6, attacking my knight. I took on d4. He played e5, hitting the knight. I retreat. And now we traded queens. This is following that Shamanov versus Sevian game as well, by the way. Now, once we got here, after king takes d1 on move 13, Bok started thinking, and I had a time advantage in the first half of this game, up through the first time control. We're still following that one game, but I wasn't sure if he had seen that or not. It was nice for me because I was still in my preparation at this point, so I haven't had to pause to think at all. But right around here, he did start taking a lot of time trying to find the best setup for black. And he played knight c6. The Shamanov-Sevian game went bishop d7. So Sevian developed his bishop here, maybe looking to get bishop a4 in. But I think White got an advantage after like king e1, bishop a4, knight c5, bishop back to c6, bishop e3, knight f6, and then f3. You can check out this game if you like, but long story short, White's bishop pair was a significant asset. And that's kind of what I'm hoping for in this entire line. I'm not just trading a bunch of pieces and allowing the queen trade for nothing. I'm hoping that that white pair of bishops will be significant down the road. So Bok played more accurately than Sevian. He played knight c6. I developed bishop e3. Bishop out to f5. Good square. On f5, he controls the c2 square, so I can't bring my king there in the future. Also, Black prepares castling queenside. Note that the bishop on e6 could just be a target for my knight if I jump knight c5. He doesn't really want to allow that. So bishop f5, and now I just sidestepped a potential check on the d file by playing king e1. Black played knight f6, and I went rook c1. So rook c1 is played just to guard the c2 square. I don't want Black playing bishop c2 at an inconvenient time. Here Bok castled. Now, I was still in my prep up through rook c1. I had briefly looked at this position before the game. I wasn't completely sure that Bok was going to play the triangle, but it's one of the lines I prepared for because it is in his repertoire. And I had this position on my computer before the game. And now, after he castled queenside, I was sort of on my own. I kind of remembered what the computer was recommending here, but it's important to recognize that this is also the type of position where a computer is not going to be 100% trustworthy. It's, I'd say, a pretty balanced game at the moment. Even though White has the bishop pair, Black does have a little bit more coherent of a setup, if you will. Like, my king is going to be kind of clumsy, and it's going to block my rooks from connecting. I still do think that white could look forward to exploiting the bishop pair in the long run, but I can't claim that white is just better here because most likely the position's just equal. Um, Still, though, I was happy to be in a position where I was at least somewhat familiar. So right here, I think I made maybe a slight inaccuracy. Or sorry, not here. I played bishop b6. This is fine. Attacking the rook on d8. He played rook d7. Yeah, for some reason in my preparation, I was assuming that should my bishop ever come into d6, he would play rook d6 instead. But I think Bok's move, rook d7, is more sophisticated than putting the rook on d6. At first sight, this doesn't appear to make much sense, like putting it here, because he's inviting knight c5. But the thing I quickly realized is that knight c5, this square isn't a great one for the white knight. We do gain a tempo on the rook immediately, but it's not a guarantee that white's knight is going to be feeling good on this square. Moreover, the bishop on b6 could be boxed in. So say black plays something like rook e7. I'm not really sure about white's setup here. I somehow feel these minor pieces could be on much better squares. So after rook d7, here's where I think I made a slight mistake. I played the move bishop e2. You'll notice I gave this a dubious symbol because I think it is questionable. I think I should have played pawn f3 and just prepared for my king to come to the f2 square. I think that would have been a better way to treat the position and leave the bishop on f1 for now. I had a reason for playing bishop e2. I was thinking that if I play f3 instead, that black may play bishop d3, with the following line being possible: knight c5, and now bishop takes f1. This is the move and the line I really didn't like. Bishop takes f1 is clever because if knight takes d7, trying to win the exchange, black just takes back with the knight. Knight takes d7, and he's on my bishop on b6. So if I take his bishop on f1, then he's going to take here, and he has two knights for the rook. Not ideal for white. White's in big trouble here. So that's why I avoided playing f3, because I just thought it would invite bishop to d3. The engine says I don't have to fear anything here. I think it was just suggesting some normal move for white, but I was kind of intent on keeping my pair of bishops, when in reality I should have been okay with the possibility of the light square bishops being traded. So with bishop e2, I had in mind that if black does play bishop d3, I might come back here and keep the bishops. But as we'll see, this move gives me a few issues. So Bok played sensibly. He just played rook e8, bringing his last piece into the game. Now I played f3. And here, Bok decides to open the position, or try to open the position. I think he's got all his pieces nicely coordinated, and paradoxically, even though black does not possess the bishops, he still wouldn't mind the position opening up because my king is so awkward. If I had already played king f2 and maybe rook he1 or something, then black may think twice about his next move, but I think the way he did it, by playing e4 right away, is a good way to try to exploit this slight lack of harmony in white's position. So with e4, he's making the presence of the rook on the e-file known, because I don't think I really want to take here. Taking on e4 looks like it's asking for trouble. Conceivably, I think black could take back any way on e4. Even just rook takes is probably good. Pinning my bishop on e2, this is a threat. Bishop takes also looks pretty strong. Yeah, threatening the pawn on g2. So after e4, I want to keep the position closed. So I thought about either king f2 or just pushing past with f4. I thought on king f2 that black would take, and I might have to damage my pawn structure with g takes f3. Because if I play bishop takes f3, that invites moves like knight e5. And I've got certain weak squares like d3, for instance. I wasn't liking the look of this position. So all in all, I was just hoping to keep as many lines closed as possible for the time being, so I pushed past with f4, giving black a protected passed pawn, but hoping to play around it. Here Bok played bishop g4. His bishop on f5 is now blocked, so I think it makes sense for him to offer a trade. And now I played, I think, another somewhat dubious move. This move looked correct at the time, but it doesn't help me much. I played rook to c3. just hoping to activate my rook on the third rank. It seemed marginally better than having the rook on c1. Already, to be honest, it was kind of hard to find a plan for white. I wasn't completely thrilled about my prospects here. I felt like black had neutralized my preparation pretty well, and I was struggling to figure out what to do. I could trade myself on g4, but I didn't really see a point to doing this. And you shouldn't just trade pieces just because it's something to do. You should have a purpose behind each and every trade that you make in chess. Also, playing h3 and trying to invite black to trade on e2 came to mind, but I thought that in the case that we get a trade here, black might play knight h5, and then he's hitting not only the pawn on f4, but also the g3 square. So he's threatening knight g3 with the fork on the king and the rook. So this didn't look appealing either. So rook c3, I think, was a mistake, and maybe my best bet here is just bishop e3. So dropping the bishop back to the square right in front of black's pawn, and just trying to stay solid. I think this would have led to equality. But instead I bring the rook up, and here Bok played h5. So we've got about 20 moves to make before time control, but surprisingly I was way up on time. And I say surprisingly because even with my preparation in this line, I somehow didn't expect to be up this much time. I'm trying to remember exactly how much time he had, but probably right around here he had maybe 20 minutes or something for his next 20 moves. 15 to 20 minutes, whereas I had at least double that. So white does have a nice time edge. Problem is it's going to be hard to use it because this is not like a super open and tactical position where that time advantage might translate to more tactical opportunities. So I think h5 is a good choice by him. He introduces the possibility of taking with the h-pawn should I initiate a trade on g4, and just grabs some space on this wing in general. He does have a majority from the e-file through the h-file, so I like to move h5. Here I did take on g4. I couldn't see a clear way to proceed without capturing now. Again, I wasn't thrilled about playing h3 and weakening my position, but I had in mind to play h3 on the next move, should he take with the pawns, which is what he did. So he plays h takes g4, and now I played h3. And over the next few moves, I start to play pretty actively, trying to take advantage of Bok's time pressure. Whether this was correct or not is debatable, but I think in general it makes sense to try to adjust to what your opponent's doing on the clock. And if they're burning a lot of time and the position is otherwise pretty closed and boring, it could be correct for you to try to change the nature of the position a little bit and maybe even take a tiny risk and play a move that objectively you feel like might not be 100% sound, but could be hard for your opponent to figure out when they have limited time. h3 I think is fine, but just changing the character of the game is something that you want to keep in your head when your opponent is in time pressure. So after h3, he played his rook into d3. And I didn't want to take his rook, even though he is threatening my rook on c3, because if I trade, he gets to take with check from that rook on e8. And let's say my king goes to d2, then he comes in here. So he gets his rook to the second rank, supported by that pawn. And something like this just didn't look good for white. It felt like my position was kind of raggedy, and already black has the potential just to go up a pawn. He's threatening this and this. So I resolved to just ignore that rook on d3. So instead I took on g4. He took my rook on c3. So unfortunately I have to shatter my queenside pawns. I do have a 3-2 majority on this wing, but now those pawns are potentially weak. He took the pawn on g4, so we have material equality. Now I was banking on my next move to give me some play. So I went rook to h7, attacking the pawn on g7. If I don't play actively here, my feeling was that my worst pawn structure will just come to tell in the long run. I have 3 pawn islands compared to black's 2. And that's something that a GM can really work with. And even though I have a bishop and a knight against his 2 knights, it's not going to matter too much here. There's not enough open lines. So I wanted to press Bok on the clock. I wanted to play actively and try to turn this game around a little bit. I felt that was a little bit worse objectively. So rook h7 hitting the pawn. He went rook g8. And now my next move just felt right to me at the time, but now that I look at it with the engine, it's a mistake. And I think it's even more of a clear mistake than some of the previous moves that I've criticized. This was kind of a vexing game because there were several points where I felt like I played maybe the second-rate move. And against a lot of opponents, it might not have mattered, but against a player this strong, those little inaccuracies and second-rate decisions do accumulate. So I played bishop to d4. I thought my bishop was kind of a spectator on b6 now. It does restrict black's king a little bit, but in the spirit of trying to play actively, I wanted to bring another piece to bear down on g7. But I think this is an error, and maybe I should have just played, for instance, king e2, just bringing my king up a little bit. I overprotect e3 in that case, so I never have to worry about a knight coming here. King e2 is just a helpful move all around for white. But the die was cast, so bishop to d4. Black took it. A bit of a surprising move because this does allow white to play c takes d4 and straighten out his pawns in reply. But if you'd like to pause your video and figure out what happens if white plays c takes d4, you can do so now. Okay, so unfortunately c takes d4 will run into knight e3 with a fork on these two pawns. And I really didn't like that. Also, these two pawns lead to other pawns. So if like I save the c4 pawn but give up the g2 pawn, he would actually be winning the f4 pawn next. And potentially same thing over on the queen side. If I save my g2 pawn, like say I play g3 and allow him to take here, well then a3 is weak. Maybe I could somehow scramble out of this, but it seemed doubtful at the time. So for that reason, after knight takes d4, I took with the knight instead. Keeping my bad structure, but at least now my knight is kind of pointing in the direction where I want it to go, because I had my sights set on the king side. I figured if I can get in striking range of like the g pawn or maybe the f pawn, then maybe I can get right back in this game. So after knight takes d4, Bok played his knight back to f6. This is going to evict my rook from h7, so that was kind of annoying. I played rook h4. It's possible this move is a micro error as well. I think the engine slightly prefers rook h3 or rook h1. Maybe I'll give this to you as a quiz question once again. Of those three squares, so rook h4, rook h3, rook h1, why does rook h4 have the most appeal from an activity perspective? Like, what is white's idea in playing rook h4? Okay, so this might be a slightly easier question than the last couple, but the idea with rook h4 is simply to prepare g4. So looking to push the pawn and get up to g5. I'm initiating a minority attack using my two pawns against black's three, and I'm hoping that g4 is going to lead to something good, especially getting the pawn to g5. If I get the pawn all the way up to g5, then I may be able to go after that e4 pawn, drive away black's knight. But Bok put a stop to these aspirations. He first played king d7. And here I played knight f5. If g4 is played right away, I believe I was worried about black playing g5 in reply. I thought this would be a nasty reply. And if I take the pawn, then rook takes g5, my pawn on g4 will be lost. So I have to kind of correctly prepare that g4 move. And with knight f5, I was looking to attack this pawn on g7 again. And here he played g5. This move kind of surprised me a little bit. For some reason, I wasn't expecting him to do that. I thought something like king e6. King e6 looked more normal, just coming in and attacking the knight. But with g5, Bok is striking back on the king side, and he's not going to let me have my fun with g4. I take the pawn, takes with the rook. So now my knight and my g-pawn are both under attack. So I retreat the knight to e3, defending the pawn. And the evaluation hasn't changed a whole lot from what it was a few moves ago. I think white is still clearly worse, just due to the pawn structure, basically. Black played his king up to e6, useful move. And here I made a mistake. once again. I feel like I've been very negative about my play in this game, but this is a game where I kind of just got gradually outplayed. Sorry for the spoiler alert, but yeah, you can probably tell just by the way I'm talking about this game that Bok ground me out. I played Rook H6. I think I should have played something calm again, like King E2, and just tried to improve my position. Again, I was trying to play actively. We've still got 7 or 8 moves to go before time control, and I was worried that Black might try to transition his rook over to the queen side and play like Rook A5 and maybe go after my A3 pawn. So Rook H6 was motivated by the plan of going Knight D5, or maybe Knight G4 should Black's rook leave G5. So I'm trying to pin that knight on F6 and make it a target. But there's a clear drawback to Rook H6. And if you'd like to pause your video and find it, you can do so now. Okay, so the flaw with Rook H6 is that Black can play Rook H5. Excellent move by Bok, and he had no trouble spotting that, even in his time pressure. So Black is offering a transition into a pure knight endgame. He's just going to get the rooks off the board. And I must trade. There's nowhere my rook can go safely, so trading is forced. I suppose I could technically play Knight G4 here, but that's probably a worse version of the trade because my knight is virtually trapped on H6. So that's not a realistic option. So after the trade, all this trade has accomplished is highlight the structural defects in White's position, really. Because without the rooks on board, I have less chances for counterplay, less chances to get back in the game by playing actively and creating issues for him. And now it's just going to be a slow grind. We're in a knight endgame where material is still technically even, but with my bad pawns, I'm so heavily discounted on the queen side that I think this endgame is just lost. Here I put the chess-based symbol for Black is clearly better. I don't know if it's like technically winning yet. It's possible there's some way White can save this position, but during the game and also in talking to him afterwards, he felt this position was losing. It might be a position where only like an engine could save this for White by playing like a great many accurate moves. But from a human point of view, I think if Black is a good player, they're going to find some way to win this. This is just so difficult to hold for White. It's basically like White is playing down a pawn here because of the doubled c-pawns. And Black has a 2-to-1 advantage in this vicinity, and he's really going to use that to his advantage. So I played King D2. He played Knight F4. I played G3. Knight H5. Attacking my G-pawn. I didn't want to advance this G-pawn any further, so I played the knight back to F1. It's real torture playing these type of endings because White has no counterplay to speak of whatsoever. So I kind of just have to sit there and like let Black try various winning attempts. Here I played King E3. And I really don't mean to trivialize this ending, but as a practical player, just the way I feel about this ending is like I'm not going to save this very often. And a stronger player playing Black in this endgame is probably going to beat me the vast majority of the time. So, in my opinion, it's more interesting like what happened leading up to this endgame. Still instructive to see how Black wins, but I just wanted to put that in perspective. The damage has already been done, let's say. Note that here, I played King F2. This move looks passive, but it's important to recognize that Black is threatening knight takes G3. So if I try to say, I don't know, activate some of my pawns on the queen side, he's going to take this pawn. And after knight takes, there's F4 check. And Black gets into a winning pawn endgame after winning my knight. Say King F2, take it. And he could even just send his king over here and start gobbling these pawns. That would be a sensible thing to do right now. Oops. Sorry if you hear that whistle. My chess base is yelling at me. So yeah, this is kind of the crux of Black's strategy with an extra pawn. And you see this in many types of endgames, not just knight endgames. But the reason why this 2-to-1 majority is so great is not the fact that Black's going to promote one of those extra pawns. It's the fact that that extra pawn is at some point going to draw the attention of my remaining forces, and then black can come over with his king or maybe with another piece and start gobbling the other pawns. If you were to remove, let's say, all of these pawns, just get rid of the queenside entirely, white would be purely down a pawn with E and F against G, but that would greatly increase my drawing chances. I would love for that to happen because then black wouldn't have that plan of simply using one of his extra pawns as bait. But with so many pawns, and especially with white having so many weak pawns, I think the position is beyond hope for white. So king f2, Bok played knight f6. I played knight d2. And here he played knight e8, so kind of a funky knight move, but you'll see where he ends up sending his knight. And in fact, maybe I'll ask you guys before I make any further moves. So consider this from black's point of view. So he's just played knight e8. And actually, no, I'll give you a couple more moves. It might be too difficult otherwise. Okay, let's say here. So I'm just kind of waiting with my knight. I just moved it from f1 to d2, going back and forth. So where do you think Bok is trying to send this knight? What square did he identify as the best possible square for that piece? You can pause your video if you like. All right, so he's trying to send the knight to c5. c5 would be a fantastic square for that knight. Not only would it blockade the two c-pawns, but it has potential to come into d3 or over to a4 and attack the pawn on c3. So you'll see in a couple more moves that once the knight gets there, it has a powerful effect on the position. So he played knight e6. I went knight to b3. So I'm trying to work against the knight c5 plan. Also with knight b3, I have some desire to put the knight on d4 in the future. He played king d6. Now here's a moment where I could play knight d4 if I wanted. And at first, the engine really likes knight d4. But if knight d4 is played, how can black win? If you want to pause your video and figure that out, you can do so. This is kind of an instructive one because anytime you're looking with the engine and the engine says a move is fine and then all of a sudden it changes its mind, that kind of points to something that is a little more subtle. So knight d4 looks correct because we're hitting the pawn on f5 and a trade would just repair our structure, right? This is okay for white. Wrong. This is a bad trade for white because now black has a protected pass pawn, as they did before, but most importantly, white's king is going to be stretched in two different directions. For the moment, it has to stay guarding the advance of black's e-pawn, right? And with the move b5, black would kind of drive a wedge in between these two pawns. Or maybe not drive a wedge, that's probably the wrong way to describe this. With b5, black is really just striving to create a pass pawn on the queen side. So looking to go like a5 and b4. And white's king is going to be torn between having to defend against like a passed b pawn and also a passed e pawn. And if white were to simply trade here, this would be losing because, let's say, king e2, black's king is going to come up to d5, he's going to come here, and then king c4. And black will win this because white's king has run out of options. White would have to try something like this, but take here, this is going to be losing. Again, you can see this strategy of black coming back towards the queen side at a key moment to win the resulting endgame. So this is a useful device to keep in mind, like this move b5 and how two pass pawns can trump two connected pass pawns even. So two pawns that are kind of split. They don't have other pawns necessarily to support them, although black does have the f5 pawn to support e4. But my two connected pawns, they're kind of on the inside in the center, but they're going to fall, or not even fall, but they're going to pale in comparison to black getting the passed b pawn. So for instance, like this, b4, take. Black could even push here if he wanted and not even recapture. Now I have three connected pawns, but they scarcely matter because these pawns are faster than mine. Here, here, here. A scenario like that playing out. So Knight d4, while tempting and repairing the structure, loses in the pawn endgame. So I can't play that after king d6. So instead I played king e3. He got the knight to c5. I definitely can't trade. I would just lose my queenside pawns if I did. So here I go knight d4, attacking the pawn on f5. He brings the king back to e5. I played king d2. And we're well past move 40 now, so we got 30 additional minutes to think. Knight a4. Knight a4 is particularly annoying because not only does it hit the c3 pawn, but it threatens, in many cases, knight to b2, attacking c4. So, from the side of the board, the knight does a good job of probing both of the c-pawns. I played king c2, trying to stop knight b2. He goes back to c5. I go king d2. It's often a good idea to repeat the position when you're in control. There's that old Soviet rule of you should always repeat if you have the option of doing so because you gain time on the clock and it's possible your opponent will screw up. And Bok did this a couple times in the game, in this endgame. He repeated the position. And when this happens, I don't get excited like thinking like, oh, this guy's suddenly going to give me a draw. He doesn't know what to do. No, I know this is a method that many players, and myself included, will employ to just gain time on the clock. Because with that 30-second increment, you get 30 seconds added. So you can quickly play like knight a4 to c5 and get an extra minute of thinking time, basically. So now after king c2, here Bok makes progress. He plays f4. I take the pawn, takes with the king. Yeah, and it's just getting worse and worse for white. He's got the passed e-pawn that is still menacing, and also his king is getting very active. I would have liked to prevent his king from getting this deep into my position, but I was kind of torn, because my king can't simultaneously defend both the f4 square and the c3 pawn. So difficult decisions had to be made. So realistically here, I think I should probably play my king back to d2 and try to hold. But I decided to play actively and played king b3 instead, going after his knight. He went knight c5 check. I played king b4. Now I was hoping that there might arise some scenario where I can sacrifice my knight for the e-pawn, because now I have really no hope of having my king defend against the e-pawn advancing. So I was hoping maybe I could sacrifice my knight for the e-pawn and use my active king to go take black's remaining two pawns and get a draw. But I knew this was pretty optimistic. And Bok played correctly. He played b6, supporting the knight. So knowing that these pawns also create a little wall that my king cannot cross here, I'm unable to play these moves. So I played a4. My pawn turns out to be very badly placed on a4, but I didn't really see a viable alternative. So with a4, I'm just looking to play a5 and trade a pair of pawns, get my king in. But he played check. I went here, check again. So once more, we repeat the position. King b3. And now he plays a good move, a5. And now my king is completely shut out from the proceedings. I can't go up to b4 anymore, even if his knight is not on d3. And I realized that this position was lost. I had a bad feeling in this entire endgame and for many moves prior to this, but now it became really clear that I was lost because I've misplaced my king and I haven't managed to get any of his queenside pawns either. So I tried to rush the king back. I could try to send my knight somewhere, like moves like knight e6 and knight c6 came to mind, but it takes so many moves to go attack that pawn on b6 that I didn't even bother. There's that famous rule that if you have a piece that's diagonally 2 squares away from a knight, that's a very good position to be in. Often it's with a king, like you'll be figuring out where to move your king to escape a knight check. And moving a king diagonally 2 squares away from a knight is good because it takes the knight a minimum of 3 moves to check you after that. So at minimum, it would take me 3 moves to go attack b6, and here there's not even really a logical way I can do that, unfortunately. So I tried to get my king back, king c2. Bok played a good move, knight back to c5. Now I can't defend my a4 pawn. I played king d2. He took. Honestly, I can probably resign right about here, but I just wanted to see how he would win it, and maybe there's a chance I can drum up some last-minute counterplay, a 1 in 1,000 chance maybe. Here I played c5. With his knight coming into b2, he's attacking c4, so I tried to disrupt his pawns and, at least make him have 2 isolated pawns in capturing this. Now he's hitting my knight, and he's up 2 pawns. I played knight b3. This move might work if I was actually threatening the a5 pawn, but I'm only threatening to take the c5 pawn, so he just played king d5 and defended. I played knight back to a1. At least when I'm playing at a lost position, I know that my YouTube subscribers will get to see how a good player handles an endgame. So it's instructive for us to see how Grandmaster Bok wins this one position. So he pushed the pawn all the way down to a2. Now my knight is stuck just babysitting the a1 square. I played king d1. The e pawn comes up now. King e2, king e4. I played knight out to b3, threatening to take c5 with check. And he played a clever move, knight a5. A good way to finish the game, I think, because he says, go ahead, take my pawn on c5. He could respond with a move like king f5 then, and I'm unable to stop a1 queen because he controls the b3 square. So I moved the knight back to a1. He played c4. And here I threw in the towel. I resigned because if I play knight c2, he has the very simple plan of just going knight b3 and then queening the pawn, after which I'm down a hopeless amount of material and will be losing shortly anyways. All right, so a tough loss to stomach. I really hated losing this game with white. This put my GM norm chances in serious jeopardy because it's tough to make norms, and you have to have a 2600 performance, and I think I was at 2620 or 30 before this game, and after this it dropped me a little bit. So anyways, hope you guys got some instructive value out of this, and I'll be back again soon with more game analysis. Talk to you guys later. Bye.